Hello.
Hello?
Hi, Irving, what's up?
Okay, give me a minute.
Okay.
No, I don't.
Turn off your mic, Irving. Irving, you should turn off your mic. You're getting a lot of, we're hearing everything you're saying.
Okay.
So turn off until you're ready.
All right.
And I'm getting a lot of reverb coming from you. I'm not sure if you have something close to your mic or what.
I am muted.
I'm getting an echo. I don't know if your volume might be too loud on your device or what.
Hold on. Yes, no.
Okay, good evening, gentlemen.
Hi, Dion.
Hi.
Give me 1 sec. Let me just keep Irving there 1 sec.
Hold on.
It sounds a little better now.
Well, let me just check my phone.
It sounds a little better now, you know.
Okay.
But
Can you hear me?
yes, I'm hearing you, Irving. I'm hearing you, Edison. Yeah. So you're good. Sound good to go.
Do you guys see me?
I'm seeing you, yeah.
Okay, so I'm all right there.
You're all right. You're not seeing me because my mic is off. Not my mic, my camera is off. I just turned on my camera, so you'll see me. Hi, Bernard, what's happening?
Good, Mr. G, how are you?
Well, you know I'm never good like you and Bernard, but we're always working to get better.
Well, you always encourage me with those kind words.
Well, that's what happens when you get to my age, man. You try to encourage
it. I am sure you are as good as me and better, no doubt.
Well, don't say that in the presence of a young man called Irving Andre. He might take you seriously. Hi, Thompson, what's happening?
Yeah, hi, Sheridan. I'm good. And good night to everyone.
Yeah, good night, everybody.
Is that Loftus? Loftus, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Good enough.
Okay.
Everybody's doing fine.
Right. So what we'll do, we're going to start shortly. So we'll ask everybody to turn off their mics, to mute their mics until their turn comes to speak so we don't get feedback. I really want the audio quality to be good so we can use some of the excerpts for news purposes. So we try to avoid any feedback from the mics.
Mr. Cuffy is present.
Hi, Washbourne, how are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. Good night.
Good, man. Good to hear you, man.
Yeah, man.
Charting the way forward into our future. Together, eliminating poverty, embracing justice, peace, and togetherness. The Global View on Q. Networking Dominica with the rest of the world. The experts are in the house. From Dominica, Canada, the Caribbean, the United States, Europe, Asia, and the rest of the world. Engaging all Dominicans at home and abroad on our agriculture, our economy, our foreign relations, our justice system, our governance, our international competitiveness, our education, our world-class festivals and entertainment, sports, politics, regional cooperation, and much more. Globally positioning Dominica within the Caribbean. Join the conversation on the Global View on Q. Tune in, call us, have your say. The Global View on Q, only on Q95, the big station.
Oh, no, 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 no. Oh, no, 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 no. Oh, no, 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 no. Oh, looking out my window.
Hello,
And I'm
everybody.
thinking of tomorrow.
Hi, everybody. Hello, good evening. Very good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you in Radio Land and on the internet at home and abroad. Thank you so much for choosing Q95. This is the Global View on Q. A very warm welcome to all of our Q family listeners at home and globally. I'm Sheridan Gregoire, Mr. G. It's Tuesday, February 28th, 2023. It is the 9th Tuesday of 2023. And it's 8 p.m., 8:05 p.m., more or less, at Q95, the big station. So we're live on Facebook and YouTube. Follow us at Q95 FM Radio. Our website is www.q95da.com. Please share the live, like our pages, get the latest breaking news and reviews as it happens, when it happens, only on Q95, the big station. We are continuing to revive the spirit of graciousness, love, peace, prosperity, and unity among our Kalinago and Afro-Caribbean brothers and sisters. Tonight, the Electoral Reform Coalition is on Global View on Q. That's who we have here tonight. And I can see already we have Dr. Thompson Fontaine, we have Justice Dr. Irving Andre, we have Loftus Durand, Bernardito who is the leader of the Dominica Freedom Party. Of course, Dr. Thompson Fontaine is the leader of the EWP. I see Dr. Dion George is with us. He is representing Midcliffe. I also see that we have Mr. Severin McKenzie is here. John Blanchard is here. And let's see if I can see everybody else. But certainly quite a few people are here with us already. Tonight, Washbourne Cuffy is here, and I imagine that other folks are going to join us as we go along. But let's get going. I mean, as I said, the topic tonight is electoral reform and campaign finance reform, the way forward to steer Dominica back on the path of true democracy, human rights, civil liberties, free speech, free media, economic freedom, for free and fair elections on a level playing field. We revisit tonight, the Dennis Byron reforms. Here are a couple of questions. Do they advance the cause of democracy in Dominica? Do they create a level playing field? Do they restore faith in our democratic system of electing a government? Do they contain hidden traps? As a friend of mine would say, do they constitute Diabasak? So keynote speakers tonight, Justice Dr. Irving Andre, Dr. Thomas Fontaine, former Prime Minister, Edison James. We are hoping to have Mr. Lennox Linton, president of DWP, with us. I don't know whether Lennox is with us. If he's not, I hope he will join us later. And we hope this keynote, our keynote speakers will open the lid on the phase 1 draft electoral reform laws presented so far to Dominica by Sir Dennis Byron. They will bring clarity and unambiguity for the avoidance of any doubt whatsoever, so that Dominicans can move forward with one voice for electoral reform and for free and fair elections. Contributions will also come from civil society group leaders on the panel with us tonight. Obviously, they include Dr. Thompson Fontaine, DFP leader Bernard Ito, NJAM Vice President Severin McKenzie, political scientist Dr. Dion George, Washbourne Cuffy of the CCM. I'm not sure whether Daryl Bob is with us yet of the Dominica Business Forum. If he does come through, then he will speak on behalf of the DBF. Loftus Durand, I'm sure, will speak on behalf of Civic Vibes. And hopefully later on, we may be joined by social scientist Simeon Joseph, if he's not here with us already, and Pastor Randy Rodney, among others. Of course, all of these wonderful folks, these brilliant people, they will demystify and unravel the issues and concerns in Sir Byron's recently recommended draft laws, as the ECR looks forward to embracing the dynamic drive for proper public information, participation, and engagement to ensure that free and fair elections are enshrined in Dominica's new electoral laws and regulations. They will open the lid, of course, on Sir Byron's Phase 1 report, as we await his Phase 2 report. In the next few days in March, I understand that might be forthcoming, which will include campaign finance reform and other essentials. So the big question really for me is this, and hopefully for all of us, will it require mass peaceful public gatherings? Is that what is going to take this mass public gathering of Dominicans to press the demand for transparency on the level electoral playing field? I guess only time will tell. But stay with us at the Global View on Q tonight, much more on electoral reform only on the big station. So meantime, Sir Dennis Byron has delivered his first report on draft legislation to the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Reform Coalition is on the Global View tonight for the specific purpose to give you the correct information about the first proposed new laws and regulations. And the ERC starts the public education consultation right tonight on the Global View on Q on the big station. The ERC says Dominica's Electoral Commission must now play its part in ensuring that the people's voice prevails in getting the correct electoral and campaign finance reforms, and thereby ensure level playing field for free and fair elections in Dominica. The Global View on Q is continuing to prepare to embrace Dominica's 45th anniversary of independence this November 2023, with distinguished guests, electoral and campaign finance reforms, and the need, of course, I believe sooner or later we have to get to that, the whole question of the restructuring, the need for restructuring the Electoral Commission itself, so as to ensure that the appropriate sectors and civil society are well represented, rather than allow it to be manipulated or to simply exist at the whims and fancies of the political directorate. So wherever you are in Dominica, in the region and globally, tell your friends and associates, tune in, call in and join the conversation. Get the answers to your questions, be part of the solution. Have your say as you do every Tuesday from 8 p.m. with me, Mr. G on the Global View on Q. So here's my opening contribution tonight. In my capacity as president of the Nature Islands Dominica Civil Liberties Foundation, NITCLIF, I can tell you that NITCLIF supports democracy, supports human rights and civil liberties, free and fair elections and economic freedoms for all Dominicans. NITCLIF is not a member of the Electoral Reform Coalition, but we support the work of the ERC, the work that is doing to secure electoral and campaign finance reforms that will hopefully level electoral playing field and help create a better environment for free and fair elections, for democracy, human rights, and freedoms in Dominica. So NITCLIF is prepared to help in raising funds worldwide for the cause of ensuring economic freedom, free media, free speech, and so on. You know, certainly the abuse of women and the elderly, maintaining democracy, and so on. Tonight, we talk about completing and implementing all necessary electoral reforms by May 2023, in keeping with the schedules already recommended by Sir Dennis Byron. Passing the new people-approved electoral laws in Parliament by the end of April 2023, so as to allow the Electoral Commission to do its groundwork to cleanse the voters list, complete the re-registration process, issue voter ID cards, implement the new laws, including campaign finance laws and regulations, and possibly begin the process to restructure the commission itself. But to get all these things over and done with in the ensuing 6 months by November 2023, in order for the commission, Electoral Commission, to be truly in a position to hold free and fair elections in Dominica, anywhere from the first quarter of 2024. So all right-thinking Dominicans must therefore pursue good governance and ensure that our Constitution protects the independence of the institutions that are the pillars of our democracy. These institutions must not be subject to the whims, fancies, and manipulations of any political directorate or politicians that have gone rogue or who have authoritarian or dictatorial tendencies or aspirations. So going forward, our Constitution and duly appointed, hopefully, we will see the parliamentary commissioner appointed as mandated by the Constitution. And that must ensure that all truly independent national commissioners who have authoritarian or dictatorial independent institutions like the Electoral Commission, Integrity in Public Office Commission, the Police Service Commission, the Public Service Commission, and the like. So we continue to prepare to embrace Dominica's 45th anniversary of independence, this 2023, with tonight's distinguished panels and the ERC panelists, recognizing, as we always do, the imperative for true resilience and sustainability of our Kalinago and Afro-Caribbean brothers and sisters. So as usual, huge shout out, hugs, much love, appreciation, a big thank you to healthcare providers, frontline workers, and other public period or the someone's audio is open, so please close the mic. Happy to have you with all of us tonight. We welcome you warmly and embrace you wherever you are, in every nook and cranny, in every village, every community in Dominica, in the region and globally. Thank you, Sherwin, for keeping us on the air. Thank you, Lambi, on the console, Q95 tonight, directing the traffic. We will take your calls a little later. Yeah, some logistics for tonight's program. The three keynote speakers we have so far. If Mr. Lincoln comes on, he'll make the fourth speaker. They will make 10-minute presentations and take questions from the panelists until 9 p.m. Civil society group leaders and panelists, they will make their submissions and engage with the presenters from 9 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. We take your calls in between from 9 p.m. until 10:30 p.m. So that's out of the way now, so let's get started. I go first to UWP leader, Dr. Thompson Fontaine, for some introductory remarks on behalf of the Electoral Reform Coalition. Then I will go to Dr. Irving Andre to open the lead on Sir Byron's Phase 1 report while we had the Phase 2 report. And hopefully thereafter, I'll go right after to former Prime Minister Edison James, who I'm sure will also comment substantively on his expectations from Sir Dennis Byron's Phase 2 report. Meantime, let's all hope our songwriters, calypsonians, and musicians are not still being blamed and victimized when the politicians do not have positive accomplishments to write about or sing about, or when they engage in conduct that calls for scrutiny in the writer's lyrics, as has been done for centuries. I trust Dr. Thomas Fontaine and Justice Dr. Irving Andre will enlighten us on some of these calypso matters. And hopefully, Dr. Thompson Fontaine, as you make your introductory remarks, I don't know whether you may want to comment on this latest thing that we're hearing in Dominica, that some $214 million has left the country through Western Union and MoneyGram. A number of people are raising issues about that. How on earth is it possible for foreign workers to be earning so much money that they can remit such vast sums of money out of Dominica in 1 year? So maybe Dr. Thompson Fontaine and all the panelists, maybe you might want to make a comment on that as we get going. Dr. Thompson Fontaine, let me just hand over to you right now.
All right, Mr. J, a very good evening to you and to your distinguished panel. It's certainly great to be with you tonight. And let me say a very special good night to the people of Dominica. It is indeed a pleasure to be here on this very important night with talking about electoral reforms in Dominica with the Electoral Reform Coalition. And before I get into the reforms, let me just make a very quick comment about what you just raised, having to do with this monies that are going out of Dominica. What was stolen about this is that this is an announcement that was made by the Prime Minister, a Prime Minister who was elected by the Dominican public to take care of the Dominican people. Yet here he's boasting about his ability to create jobs for thousands of foreigners into Dominica. I mean, I'm stunned. You know, it's not that I'm not stunned at the amount of money going out. I'm stunned that the Prime Minister would make a boast of it. You know, and these are not jobs that are in rocket science that all people cannot attain to. These are simple jobs in construction and in agriculture that has been, you know, so whilst Dominicans are there suffering and getting $500 a month, which, by the way, I understand that the total bill for the NEP program is $40 million. So, $40 million. The total bill for all of the public servants combined in Dominica is about $200 million. So all of our public servants, all of those the over 4,000 public servants, teachers, policemen, nurses, doctors, are earning less in Dominica than foreigners. I have a serious problem with that. It means that this government is not concerned about the people of Dominica. And for the Prime Minister to make a boast of it is even more, to me, it's even more criminal, really, that you would put so much emphasis on foreign workers. And now we have a situation we just saw being circulated, a list of Chinese that are going to come into Dominica to be drivers, to be dump truck drivers, to be quarry, working at the quarry and so on. All jobs which Dominicans can do with zero training, and yet these are monies that are going out. So we have to ask ourselves a question in Dominica. Why would we have a government that is working so hard against the interests of the people of Dominica? Yeah, it's okay to create jobs. I mean, there's nothing in foreigners working in your country. But when the boast is that more foreigners are benefiting than your local people, then it's time for us to take a pause and to ask our questions, which makes the issue of electoral reform all the more critical. Because without electoral reform, we cannot fix that problem. We have already established that we have a government who does not care about the public, who does not care about the people of Dominica, who could care less whether Dominicans live or die. And yet we have a messed up electoral system. And that's the reason why we continue to call for electoral reform. And that's the reason why, as a party, the United Workers' Party took the unprecedented decision, along with the Dominican Freedom Party, to boycott the last elections that were held in December of 2022. And we did that for a very simple reason. We felt that we could not, as a party, continue to take part in a process that was so clearly meant to work against us. In other words, we had 0 to nil chance of ever winning an election under this particular broken system. Now, just to put that into context, and I will kind of set the broad context for the rest of the speakers tonight. Just to put that into context, when Dominica held elections in 1980, with a population of about 78,000 people in 1980, we had a voters list of some 38,452 persons. Okay, that was in 1980. 38,452 persons on the voters list in a population of some 77,000. Fast forward to 2022, in a population of 70,000 people, which has declined significantly, we have a voters list of 74,895 persons. So clearly more people on the voters list than we have in the population. To put that into further context, Antigua has a population of roughly 100,000 people. Antigua's population is almost 1.5 times that of Dominica, 100,000 people. Yet their voters list in the last election that was held just this year was some 42,000 people. So we have 42,000 out of 100,000. In Dominica, we have a situation of 74,895 in a population of 70,000 people. So that is what we're up against. And that's the reason why we said, no, we cannot, as a responsible party, take part in this election. And hence the need for electoral reform. Now we have before us a report that was done by Sir Byron. My understanding is that the final report will be handed in on March 25th. But we've seen enough within this report to give us some confidence that the reforms that we've been asking for will in fact be granted. And for me, my main concern as a leader of the United Workers' Party is that we get a clean voters list, a voters list that is reflective of the real population of Dominica, a voters list that respects the residency criterion. Under our existing laws, for example, you have to be a resident of Dominica for at least 12 months within that election cycle to be able to vote. That's within our existing laws. There's a recommendation in the new legislation to change that. However, there is still that residency criteria, which means that you have to be residing in Dominica for a certain period of time if you are to vote. So that is one thing. The second one has to do with the voter's ID. Dominica remains one of the few countries in the world without a valid voter's ID card system. And so that's the other thing that we're calling for. And the third thing, which is critically important, is campaign finance reforms. So we believe that now is a good time to undertake those reforms. And our call will be that when those reforms are in fact in place, after it has gone through Parliament, it has been accepted, that we should have new elections. Because we continue to maintain that the elections of December 2022 were sham elections and that they should be redone. Those elections should be scrapped. They should be redone under a new voter system. So with those few remarks, I will toss it back to you, Mr. J.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson-Fontaine. I mean, very well said. Dr. Irving Andre, the last time we were here on the Global View on Q, you gave us really a very, very, very concise, very, very clear comments on the laws that you had seen. And you also indicated to us what you have studied and what you have noticed happening in the rest of the region that have already done the electoral reform successfully. And it is showing in that the democracy, the election cycles are working very well. This time, I imagine that you've taken an even further in-depth look at what is happening there. And then you may have even looked a little closer as to what is happening in the Caribbean in terms of case studies, because part of the problem, of course, is going to be ensuring that whatever laws pass and regulations are in place are enforced, and that the institutions that are supposed to enforce them are doing their work. And so let me just go over to you, Dr. Irving Andre, so you can continue helping us with some of these issues there. You might need to turn on your mic.
Thanks for inviting me. Let me say good evening to your esteemed panelists and the members of the group of 10 or 12 who are going to ask questions. A special good evening to Washbourne Grammar School classmate and so on, and your listeners. Let me just make one comment.
I think Johnson Boston has also joined us, and he's here with us.
Right. Okay,
Yes.
I can't see him, but what the heck. Good evening also to Justin, to just Boston. Let me start with one comment on this, on the revelation, as it were, of the amount of money being sent abroad by foreign workers in Dominica. Isn't it ironic? Isn't it cruelly ironic that Dominicans have to make do with remittances from abroad by way of barrels and packets and so on, while foreigners are sending hundreds of millions of dollars made in Dominica to their relatives abroad? What this statement shows is that we have no shame. Dominica, as we speak today, we have no shame. If that is something that we are boasting about, it is confirmation we've descended into this abyss of insensitivity, this abyss of non-caring, this abyss of having no compassion for Dominicans on the ground. Because if you're talking about workers in the construction industry, and if you are talking about workers from the construction, local folks, weather truck drivers, persons doing other trades within the industry who cannot find employment, persons from the public works department who've been let out to pasture. If we cannot find within ourselves to give these folk employment, But not only are we not doing that, we are boasting that foreign workers in Dominica have sent back over $200 million to the relatives abroad. We've lost all reason. Probably those religious leaders who are singing the praises of the political directorate are not praying hard enough. Or probably they're just enjoying their own fruits of ill-gotten gains. But again, here is evidence, not that we need any more, that we've descended into a space where it's a dog-eat-dog community. There's no compassion, not even for your compatriot, your fellow man. If you had, you would bury your head in shame and you would seek to reverse that trend. But not only are we not reversing the trend, we are accentuating it, given the evidence of the influx of Chinese workers, obviously, who will be getting jobs such as driving trucks. And I know there are no Dominicans who can drive trucks, for God's sakes. And there we are, most of us, or too many of us, silent and looking at the ship as it sails by, and we continue to be pressed down into an abyss of suffering and an abyss of want. But that is not what I wanted to start to say. I can say a few words about the Calypso. Again, how much evidence do we need that there is a unscrupulous, there is a despotic obsession to control every facet of Dominican life, whether it's in voting, whether it's in politics, whether it's those who are given jobs at the prison or in the police station, whether it's with the utterance of the mantra, my pal rep sent me, whether it's in the Electoral Commission, and I'll have a few words to say about that. In every facet, you see this inexorable, this persistent, this relentless obsession to control the narrative, to control the dialogue. We heard what the comments which were made before the Calypso competition. We heard how they dismissed and they dumped on Pat Aaron. We heard the comments about DICE. But that is further evidence that we here, or the culture being developed, is to destroy every modicum of excellence that doesn't sing the praises of the own high. And that is where we are. I will say more, but let me start by making a few comments, because Mr. G, I observed an unpleasant trend in the discussion of electoral reform from last week. And let me indicate that this topic has generated, as it should in my view, tremendous debate, which at times has degenerated into personal attacks on this radio station. Now, let me state the obvious: free exchange of ideas or views is as healthy as a meal with vegetables, Mr. G, avocado, and God forbid the humble snout. We may not necessarily like the views of a caller, but that should not give us the license to personally attack him or her. After all, as a wise old woman once told me, tout les pripaka weste ada on sel tete. Now, somebody initially told me that means that they had breadfruit for breakfast. I didn't believe that. And I did finally find out the real meaning of that Creole phrase. Let us all practice what we preach. On the other two radio stations, many of the hosts and callers, they have numerous reasons for engaging in character assassination. Some of these include: 1, the failure to pay taxes; B, the passing of bad checks; 3, the failure to repay bills; 4, soliciting sex from underage girls; 5, seeking various favors; and F, having close encounters of an intimate kind with members of their own flock. In attacking persons who are merely exercising their right to express themselves, many of those folks, they are absolved by the political directorate of their financial or moral sins, and they receive the blessings of the Most on High to continue their attacks. We are above that. And so with these opening words, let us once again look at electoral reform, a topic which has, as I said, generated much discussion. A few weeks ago, I made 3 essential points, what struck me in Sir Byron's initial report. It's a case of the good, the bad, and the ugly. With respect to the good, I identified two measures that he identified, which in my view is pointed to the right direction. He had the audacity to refer to the CCJ's decision, the July 5th, 2022, where the CCJ warned that we should not have another election with these electoral taints. Despite their clear direction, the political directorate decided to have another election on December 6th, 2022, in open defiance of the anticipated report from Sir Byron. It was basically a slap in the face. It was basically a sign of gross disrespect. And no amount of lipstick or no amount of window dressing or no amount of cosmetics can hide that fact. Needless to say, or despite that, in his report, Sir Byron said something which I agree with. We need up-to-date technology to ensure that there is no fraud in the voting system. He recommended, for example, fingerprinting of voters to ensure that no voter doesn't vote in different constituencies, thereby negating the integrity of the process. In my view, that is a great proposal. He also said that CBI citizens are not eligible to vote. He did mention a caveat, and that caveat was unless they reside in a constituency for 3 months preceding an election. And the most contentious proposal was that to deal with overseas or Dominicans abroad voting in our elections. And I think much of my focus will be on that controversial recommendation. Essentially, he indicates that if someone visits Dominica for a total period of 80 days in a 5-year period, he or she is eligible to vote, presumably in the constituency where he or she lived during their visits. That, in my view, is the most controversial. That, in my view, is the proposal which opens the door, Pandora's box, to the same type of fraud that we have experienced in the past. Let us reverse and ask ourselves, how did we get there with respect to that type of proposal? I have made the point, and I'll reiterate again this evening, that virtually all islands in the Eastern Caribbean, they have similar provisions with respect to eligibility to vote. You have to reside in a constituency for a certain period prior to the election. It's not rocket science. There is no controversy with respect to the meaning of the word reside. And I point out a few things to you. Bear in mind that this word only became controversial with the illegal practice of importing Dominicans from abroad to vote. They tried to do this in St. Kitts. We know what the St. Kitts people did. They stopped it. It is not done in any other country, because in no other country is there any controversy about the meaning of the word reside. The word meaning or the word reside is as controversial. The meaning of that word, Mr. G, is as controversial as a line from an old Dominican Creole song, cultural song. And I think it goes something like that, is Emil Pasa Jaka. It is as controversial as that word. Why is it controversial? It should not be. It should not be controversial because in 2013, I believe, yes, 2013, there was a decision by a Justice Thomas arising out of St. Kitts. Now, I don't know if Sir Byron knows where St. Kitts is. I don't know if he knows anything about that country or that island, or he knows anything about the decisions emanating from that jurisdiction. And in that jurisdiction, Thomas J. had occasion to contemplate the meaning of the word reside. And here's what he has to say in a case called Keisha Richards, I believe. Is it Keisha Richards? Yeah, whatever. Keisha Archibald versus Leroy Jones, 2013. Here's what he had to say in paragraph 19, and he's quoting from a decision in England. And he says, quote, I also would begin, he's quoting a judge, I also would begin when considering what is meant by the word reside by observing Viscount Cave's acceptance of the definition in the Oxford English Dictionary, which my Lord has read, namely, to dwell permanently or for a considerable time, to have one settled or usual abode, to live in or at a particular place. That's what they said. And Thomas J. went on, paragraph 20. The notion of ordinary resident is not confined to matters of elections. It is a general rule of wide application. For instance, in the sphere of revenue law, the following is to be found in Pinson on revenue law, some old text, but it has some authority. And the text indicates as follows: ordinary residence is broadly equivalent to habitual residence and contrasts with casual or occasional residence, as when you visit somewhere for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. That's casual or occasional residence. The question whether an ordinarily resident in the United Kingdom in any year of assessment has to be answered by examining his or her pattern of life over a period of years in that respect. The concept of ordinary residence resembles domicile more than residence. So the courts basically have said very simple. The definition of residence is habitual as opposed to occasional residence in a space. So if you are visiting Dominica, for God's sakes, at a time when you are residing in the United States or the Virgin Islands or Guadeloupe and Martinique for years, for decades, to suggest that somehow that definition of residence should be broadened, should be expanded like an elastic, to ensure that the pattern of Dominicans abroad coming to vote continues, is disingenuous. It is disrespectful of the Dominican community. This is a proposal being made in Dominica and in no other island. No Pamuntu, that's all. Why should we be saddled with that definition of residence? Sir Byron will not apply it in St. Kitts or St. Lucia, where he presently resides. Why should we stop with that definition, which enables the wholesale importation of prospective voters to Dominica, to dilute the vote of Dominicans resident in Dominica? Why? And what makes it worse? Something Sir Byron hasn't addressed, as well-intentioned as he is, but this is a compromise proposal. This is his compromise based on what the other side wants. He's not telling them, no, it is not done throughout the English-speaking Caribbean, but he's saying, okay, I'll compromise so you can have your cake and eat it. Who is going to do that registration? The same Electoral Commission? But hold on. Isn't that the same Electoral Commission who is turning a blind eye to voters voting illegally in Dominica? Voters voting in constituencies where they do not live? The commission which has refused to clean the list. And I know this is the Lenten season. Is it not in the Lenten season that we speak about Lazarus, Mr. G? I think so.
Yes, I think so as well.
Oh, I saw you looking at your iPad, but at least you confirmed it.
Well, that's just my age. I'm just showing my age.
Well, age is wisdom. You look like Methuselah, whatever his name. I'm not his uncle. But that's the point. Is that the same Electoral Commission that Sir Byron is depending on to ensure that it is those who've been in Dominica for 80 days in a 5-year period who will become eligible to vote? And let me get one thing out of the way. In the past few days, I know persons have taken shots at like Hillary Shillingford and Wayne James. I think this is unfortunate. They constitute a minority on the Electoral Commission. The last time I checked, they do not have veto powers. They do not have the deciding voice on what happens in the Electoral Commission. So rather than blame them, we have to blame those who have the deciding voice on the commission. But the flaw, the Achilles heel of Sir Byron's recommendation with respect to that provision, who is going to ensure compliance with any legislation with that kind of recommendation? Who? Who is going to benefit from it? Those who will benefit from it, will they ensure strict compliance with it? Has there been strict compliance with the legislation in the past? No, there hasn't, and we know why. Because this is not only a Pandora's box. Somebody drew the analogy of the Trojan horse. It is worse than that. Mr. G, the only time I saw you dance hopscotch was when there was red ants in your pants. And that's exactly what this thing is analogous to. It will have Dominicans jumping in hysteria because this proposal will change nothing in terms of the past. It will be another avenue whereby there will be a manipulation of the process. And then sadly, the parties on high will be able to say, we have instituted the reforms proposed by Sir Byron. So he has given us the legitimacy. He has normalized what we've been doing before. Because what has been done before is to breach the electoral laws, the laws which place a condition precedent on prospective voters that they have to reside in the constituency for 3 months. But once we start playing with that decision, if you come for 2 weeks, Gasso, you're ordinarily resident. If you come for 80 days, assuming without deciding that those 80 days actually will reflect how much time you spent in Dominica. So the whole process or the whole definition of residence will be diluted. But why? For what legitimate purpose? We know why. There's no mystery. Because if we were truly interested in decent electoral reform, which would ensure that everyone has a free and fair chance of competing, there will be no need to change what is not busted. There will be no need to change what is broken. Because what has been happening over the years is the hunt for a certain type of electoral reform. Remember what happened after the CCJ decision in July of 2022? The Attorney General, the so-called people's lawyer, Gasson, sent a letter. He's sending a letter to the CCJ. This guy knows nothing about judicial independence, asking them to clarify, to give an explanation for their gratuitous interpretation or comments with respect to the taints in Dominica's election. You know, and this is not the first time. So it's a matter of controlling every aspect of Dominican life. That's why we're doomed. That's why we can boast how much foreigners are making in Dominica, Gasson. That's why we can talk about young men smoking marijuana left, right, and center in every little town in Dominica. Because what have we done for them? What programs have we offered them? What hope have we given them? What concessions have we given them? Didn't the government pardon, and correct me if I'm wrong, $14 million of taxes or duty-free, whatever it is, to some foreign company?
Yes, they did.
Huh? And when compare that to what is done at Christmas, concessions to import barrels, they give you a narrow window, 3 weeks to 30 days. When to send a barrel from North America, it takes 4 to 6 weeks. So the whole thing is a joke. But you will excuse 14, and I apologize if my number is wrong, but I think it is right. $1 million tax-free concessions to foreign companies, Gaston.
Dr. Andre, let me just ask you this, in a word, or in a sentence, what would you recommend in terms of the residency requirement? What would be your recommendation?
I would leave it as it was. Why? Because a lot of this has come about because persons abroad have said, oh, you're disentitling me from voting, exercising my right. What right? You live in North America. You got all the incentives after COVID-19. You have access to healthcare. You have choices in terms of shopping. You enjoy a certain degree of security. You have law enforcement working, responding if there are offenses committed against you or a member of your family. You enjoy the benefits of a free functioning democracy. You're telling me that while you're enjoying these benefits, you want to parachute, well, actually I'm wrong. You want to be parachuted into Dominica to vote and to impose an administration which will not even give poor Dominicans help after they've received money to help poor Dominicans to provide relief. Huh? So what are you telling me about the rights of Dominicans who reside for decades abroad? Their rights being taken away by not being allowed to vote? If you want to vote, come back and live like everybody else. As in every other island, I should reiterate. So in my view, in summary, I know you have a few speakers.
Yes.
That unfortunately is an unfortunate development with respect to these reforms. And quite frankly, I think it will cause more harm than good in Dominica. Thank you.
So I think you're saying essentially leave this thing, the residence requirement as it is existing in the law now, and just ensure that it is enforced. So once the re-registration takes place and the voters list is clean, you're going to ensure that people, their residence will be clear. So then once all you do have to is enforce the law. Mr. James, let me go over to you. In addition to what Dr. Andre is talking about, the residence requirement and so on, one of the observations that I have is that a number of things have changed. And so whatever draft laws, whatever bills that are going to come out of this from Sir Byron and informed hopefully by our public discourse and what the discussion is going to take place over the next few days, these bills are going to go to Parliament. Now, in the Parliament, things have changed slightly because what you have now, no established political parties in opposition in the Parliament. What you have now is independent candidates, and senators nominated by independent candidates. So in essence, the debate that is going to take place on those bills in the Parliament would have to be taking place between the independent candidates and the senators that they've appointed and the government side. So I'm just drawing that to all of our attention because you no longer have your Freedom Party in there in the Parliament. What you have is independent candidates. So we're hopeful that the independent candidates and their senators who are in there will have informed themselves sufficiently about all of what we're discussing here, all of those draft laws and bills and regulations to ensure that they can have a very substantive, lively debate in the Parliament on those bills. Mr. James, let me just go over to you to make your additional contribution.
Thank you very much, Sheridan. Can you hear me?
We're hearing you very well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And good evening to you, good evening to your viewers, listeners, and good evening to everybody else who is engaged.
Oh, incidentally, Mr. James, let me just let everybody know, because we're not using our regular StreamYard platform, we're using Zoom, which is what the Electoral Reform Coalition normally uses. So those persons who are following us on Facebook and YouTube, I think they would have to, instead of getting us, I'm not sure you can get us yet on Q95 FM radio on Facebook, but you'll get us on WICE QFM on Facebook right now. Sheridan is trying to link us to Q95 FM radio on Facebook and on YouTube. So hopefully you can get us right now on Facebook and on YouTube at WICE QFM. Thanks a lot, Mr. James. Go right ahead.
Okay, so could I reclaim my time?
Yes, you can.
Okay, just to say, Sheridan, I heard your very clear and extensive promotion of this program tonight. And I decided to prepare myself in the context of what I heard you say that I was going to do. So if I miss out on some of the things that you expect me to tonight, it's perhaps because I tried to stick to what you said you wanted me to do. That we're going to talk about the Sir Byron's report and seek to get clarity to deal with the ambiguity that might be around coming out with respect to Sir Byron's exercise. I want to say that as far as I'm concerned, we are dealing with electoral reform. I noticed that there has been a move to try and bring in a new term, electoral modernization. I've looked at the terms of reference given to Sir Byron, and I've read through his report in detail. And I've seen the word modernization mentioned once in his report. And it's a very, insignificant in terms of the importance we are trying to give it here. But with respect to the question of clarity and the question of removing ambiguity, let me try to deal with what my understanding is of what has happened and what is to happen with respect to this electoral reform as it pertains to the exercise that Byron was engaged to do. The clarity and unambiguity, as far as I understand it, there is this notion that Mr. Byron was unconstitutionally appointed and Ms. Sheridan had no right to appoint him and all that. That is not true. There's the view that is the Electoral Commission that I should be doing this and so on. The question is, the Electoral Commission, which has the constitutional responsibility for registering voters and for conducting elections, the Electoral Commission gets its authority from the Constitution, and that very Constitution says that those functions and those responsibilities are subject to law. That means a law must be passed, or laws must be passed to give the Electoral Commission its functions and its authority to do things. There are existing laws which give the Electoral Commission authority as it stands now. They are contained in the Constitution, in various laws, whether it's the House of Assembly Act, the Registration of Electors Act and its regulations, the Disqualification Act, House of Assembly Disqualification Act, or the House of Assembly Petition Rules and those other things, or judicial decisions. Okay, there are these laws and rules and regulations. When the laws are passed, then the Electoral Commission kicks in with respect to its work. The laws, according to the Constitution, when these laws are being considered, the Constitution provides that the Electoral Commission must be engaged by the executive, must be engaged, that is, the proposals for any legislative matter dealing with elections, the proposals must be sent to the Electoral Commission so that the Commission can make its comments. They must be sent also to the Chief Elections Officer, and then the process completes. But it is the executive that initiates the question of putting laws before the Parliament, which indeed makes the laws. So there was no constitutional bar to Mr. Sheridan engaging Mr. Byron to do this consultancy. So let's get that clear. I consider the report that Mr. Byron has presented, and I've heard comments made that we should have a white paper. I would probably say that that could be regarded as a white paper. It sets out the broad principles and policies on which the electoral laws or the laws would be made. So I consider it could be considered a white paper. Now, in addition to the report, the white paper, with the authority, the concurrence of the Electoral Commission, the existing Electoral Commission, it's the same one as the one just went out. A draft, it was agreed that not only would a report be presented by Sir Byron, but draft legislation would accompany that report. Draft legislation which would give effect to the major recommendations that were contained in that report. And so we have draft legislation as part of the first phase of the report, draft legislation dealing with the registration of electors and also the regulations accompanying these regulations. And there's the scope of work which was given to Byron by the executive. And interestingly, that scope of work suggested that Sir Byron should take into consideration some recommendations that were made by an expert in an election some time ago. The approach that was taken by Sir Byron involved extensive consultations, and that was provided for in the terms of reference and the scope of works that he was supposed to do. And as I understand it, as I look at the report, Sir Byron said that he sought written and oral submissions, and that he sought those from stakeholders. And the question is now, the stakeholders I think he identified included, let me see if I get it here, the stakeholders that were identified who contributed included, I read it here, the Dominica Labour Party, the United Workers' Party, the Dominica Business Forum. Written submissions were made by 27 organizations. Of the 27 participants, 6 persons were affiliated with political parties, including the opposition, another 10 with the government organization, with non-government organizations, and 12 persons listed as other made submissions. There was an election survey. The question is, to what extent, and there are a number of stakeholders as part of this program tonight. The question is, and as we open up the discussion, question is would be, to what extent are the stakeholders who were a part of the consultation satisfied with the contributions that their contributions were reflected in the report and the recommendations? That is important. Okay. Sir Byron makes the observation that these reforms are important, or the importance of these reforms were emphasized by the CCJ. And Dr. Andre referred to the CCJ comments. Let me stop and make the point that the 2019 elections, as we know, and is reflected in the report, was the subject of a lot of concern by Dominicans. Okay, the suggestion that elections in the past were free and fair, that is not true, and that is emphasized by the comments of the CCJ. And any notion that the CCJ was out of place to make these observations and comments is totally misguided. Okay, and I think we also need to recognize the significance of taking this matter to the CCJ, notwithstanding the barriers that were put in its place. And let me just stag a little bit. We have to recognize the damage that was done to the process at the High Court when the matter of the petitions was presented in High Court and the judge gave the ruling that he gave. I'm aware of a comment that was made by a King's Counsel in the region that decision was intellectually corrupt, and the only reason why he wouldn't say it was financially corrupt is because he didn't have the evidence. So it was really important, and we need to recognize how important it is that matter was actually taken up to the CCJ. So the CCJ could give its comments. The CCJ's comments, I suspect, has put the current administration in a position where it believes that there's a general attitude that 2019 elections, that the victors who, quote unquote, emerging from those 2019 elections, that was tainted, contaminated, you're illegitimate. Okay, and that is why you see, although the CCJ said that future elections should not be held under these conditions, we had the 2022 elections held under those same conditions. So it could be argued that this regime is also, as the lawyer who went to the CCJ said, this regime could be considered illegitimate. We talk about the Commonwealth OAS special mission of observers. But remember, Sheridan, that we had Commonwealth, we had OAS, we had CARICOM, observer elections in the past. The 2014 elections, the Commonwealth observers said they were free, but not necessarily fair. Okay, so Sir Dennis has given a timetable within which the reform process should be held. And remember, we must never forget, we paid Sir Dennis somewhere in the region of $650,000 to make these recommendations to us. So it's not something we can take lightly and put aside. No. We are hearing about, you get the impression now, Sheridan, that there's a move by Mr. Skerritt to delay the process of electoral reform. A delay tactic approach is being engaged here. Because when you hear talk about experts now being engaged to lead the public consultations, what is that about? The mandate that was given to Sir Dennis, the scope of work that was given to him, provided for widespread consultation. Sir Dennis is an expert. Sir Dennis is what we call him again, the erudite former CCJ president and all that. Why we've had experts come in before and given us recommendations, they've been set aside. So when we have reached this stage we've reached now, and we hear talk about experts coming in to lead public consultations, then that to me is a delay tactic. So Dennis has given some deadlines. And I think going forward, we should be looking at how we as a people influence what is going forward. You mentioned the question of what is going to be in the parliament, that the parliament will not have representation from major political parties and so on. Well, the people must recognize that. And the people must, before the parliament convenes, must have so articulated their positions, so presented their positions that their views, what positions they hold will be very starkly in front of the people who are going to the parliament to effect those legislations. The deadline, again, Sir Dennis indicated that his recommendations will be in two phases. And the first phase, which would have been given in November, towards the end of November last year, would deal with the legislation regarding the registration of voters and electors. That report, although it was marked draft at the top, was presented at the end of November. Unfortunately, Mr. Skerritt again, as many people suggest, in bad faith, then call elections and put a spoke in the wheel. So that report was submitted at the end of November. There was ample time for the report to have been studied by the executive, for the population to have been engaged in that discussion, so that the legislation could have been passed in the parliament in January, as was recommended by Sir Dennis Byron. You understand where I'm going? That was the timetable. So that is why when I hear people say that or take issue with the opposition, the United Workers' Party, for suggesting that the legislation should have been passed in January, suggesting there was a move to deny the population an opportunity for consultation, that's not so. That position that the legislation regarding the registration should have been done in January, that was on the basis that the recommended timetable by Sir Dennis was that his report with his recommendations and draft legislation would have been with the government, as it was with the executive, by the end of November, allowing for consultation and discussion and legislative action taken in January. The idea is the registration of electors and the regulation, the registration is very crucial to the whole process of cleaning the list. Cleaning the list and provision of identification cards, these are two central aspects of electoral reform, two central aspects. So the idea is to give as much time as possible for the Electoral Commission, armed with these new bits of legislation, because remember, the Electoral Commission can work only based on the laws that have been passed by the government in the parliament. The Electoral Commission has no authority now on the existing legislation to issue identification, fingerprints, identification, has no authority to do that. There are certain other things that it doesn't have authority to do. You require legislation for that. Okay. The Electoral Commission has the authority, and it could have gone around the country and done a re-enumeration, which it's tried to do in 2017, 2018, 2019, but did not have the money. And the government blocked the attempt by refusing to provide the money. That is why it is necessary for the reform as it goes forward to include provisions that will allow the Electoral Commission to have that level of independence, that its program could not be scuttled by an administration refusing to make the money available to it. Okay, so there's a deadline for the legislation. I see there's talk about Sir Byron. I heard Mr. Skerry say that Sir Byron has said that his final report will come on the 25th of March. Now, if that is so, that final report should be a one that reflects any recommendations that are made by coming out of these kinds of discussions here, any recommendations that are made, and so on. But Mr. Skerry said that the process has been transparent, as it has always been, and he expects the process to be transparent. It hasn't always been. So as we move forward, the second phase, I was going to say that to the extent that there's this 25th of March deadline for Dennis's second final report. My understanding is that there are proposals there for the Electoral Commission, armed with this legislative tool, to decide that there is a period of 6 months by which the new register will emerge. My understanding is, from what I saw in the proposed legislation, is that on the appointed day, that is, once the legislation is passed, everybody on the register of electors will comprise everybody who's on the list now, the bloated list, the contaminated list, whatever. And there will be a 6-month period during which a process will be engaged, at the end of which people will have ID cards. And when you have that ID card at the end of the 6 months, that is when you are now confirmed. And anybody who does not have that ID card by the end of that 6-month period, or any 2 months or so extension, anybody who does not have that ID card, your name will be off the list. So the list, the legitimate list, will comprise only those people who have ID cards which will include their fingerprints and those kind of details. That is how I understand the process should go. Now, it is important for people now, all of us now, to fully understand what's before us. There is provision, as you heard from Dr. Andrew, and as you know, that deals with this question of residency. It is suggested that the residency provisions now in the law should stand. I don't agree. Let me tell you what the residence provision is in the act, and Dr. Andrew will probably help me contradict me if I'm wrong. Residency is mentioned only in the context of one having to be resident in a polling district for at least 3 months. That is where residency is. The other aspect that we've been grappling with is where it is provided that once you're on the list, so you're registered. So residency has to do with registration. Once you're registered, then you're on the list. The next reference to this is when it says that you will be removed from the list if you have been away for more than 5 years. It doesn't say resident if you have been away from the country for more than 5 years. But that has been circumvented by people coming back here for 2 days, coming back for a funeral, a wedding, because that means you have been back here within that 5-year period. It's my view that that is wrong. That is not where the intention is, but that is the word of the law. And Dr. Andrew will help me to if I'm misunderstanding. So I believe it is necessary to have the amendment to define what residency is in the context of what Dr. Andrew mentioned. That is clearly defined. I heard him talk about it a while ago. It is clearly defined what residency is. So residency should be, if you are no longer resident in Dominica, then your name gets off the list. And there is residency will be defined in the context of the judicial ruling that he spoke about. So that is where I would be on this matter. And I think it's important for us to pay attention and do not allow Mr. Skerry to get involved in this delay tactics that he's doing. I see in your promo, you drawing the people's attention to the fact that there can be peaceful protests. 5,000 people, I think 500 people, I think you were suggesting, Mr. Gregoire. It should be more, okay? But
Well,
we should not allow.
I did not mention a figure. I mentioned peaceful gatherings where people can express themselves in a very forceful way, so that the authorities can get the message that they really want. They really want the electoral.
So I believe now the Electoral Commission, notwithstanding it does not have the legislative authority, the constitutional authority, because there's not the legislation to do the fingerprinting and so on. It knows what is being proposed by Sir Dennis Byron, because the proposals were developed in consultation with the Commission. So the Electoral Commission should be prepared to get engaged in the education process that has to be embarked upon all now. It should be able to get involved. The political parties should be able to get involved. Civil society should be able to get involved. But what you are doing here tonight is important for us to have a common understanding, a common approach as to what we are going to be saying to the people. I think we should stand up and say, no, the confirmation, which is the report proposes, where the report proposes that the Electoral Commission sends people overseas to be involved in the confirmation, send them to selected locations. That is out. That should be out, because that is discriminatory. It should be out, and these sort of things. So that is where I think we should get ourselves on the same hymn sheet, and then move forward to impress upon the government what we want as the final outcome. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I will come back later, a little later on, to Dr. Andre, so we can clarify the residency thing, because I think that is very important. Because I mean, you can only reside in one place. If you live in New York, well, you come home to Dominica to visit, and you go back home to New York where you reside, right? So, I mean, that's clear. I think Dr. Andre was very clear on the definition of what residency really means. But what I'm hoping that we will leave here tonight with is some kind of consensus on the big issues. And seems to me, Dr. Andre and yourself both clearly define. The re-registration is fine. Once you re-register everyone in Dominica, and people have to come to Dominica to re-register, that will take care of cleaning up the voters list, removing all those dead people's names. Dead people cannot come and re-register. So I think that would take care of that.
Yeah, because Sheridan, registration is supposed to be done in Dominica. Registration is done in Dominica. Voting is done in Dominica. Confirmation should be done in Dominica.
Yes, so if we can agree on things like that, and then of course on the whole question of the residency, I hope we can come to a conclusion on that as well. Certainly, I would think that in the new legislation, if you need the amendment, fingerprinting, I think, as Dr. Andre already said, that is important. That is probably the best way to go to ensure the person's ID. You know, there's no doubt about that. Here's what I want to say too. And I want to go to Bernard, because, you know, he's the leader of the other major political party, the Dominica Freedom Party. Bernard, everything that you've heard so far, I mean, see, to me, there are two big issues here. There are some nitty-gritty details, but I think the two fundamental issues are the question of registration, re-registration, and everything to be done in Dominica. People come home, so there can be avoidance of, there's no doubt at all that everything is, you know, is hunky-dory, right? And then secondly, the question of residency. But I think we will hopefully go back to Dr. Henry to clarify that for us later on. Hopefully can come to an agreement on what that should look like. And then what I'm hoping we can come out of here with, Bernard, is some consensus on those big issues, those big ticket issues, so that the Electoral Reform Coalition can go forward with everybody singing from the same hymn sheet. Maybe somebody can craft a position paper based on those things. Say, oh, these are the essential, the real basic things that we want, the big ticket items we want in there. The rest of it, you know, is going to be easy to deal with. Even as a matter of fact, when Mr. James mentioned campaign finance reform, this may not be as difficult as a question of registration and residency. Because, I mean, it might be easy to come up with a figure, because, I mean, you know, all these countries have figures. Jamaica has figures. If, for example, let us say for argument's sake, we came out with a figure, say $30 per constituent per constituent in a constituency. You know, if that is the most you can raise. So if you have 1,000, you're talking 30,000. If you have 10,000, you're talking about, you know, 10,000 by 30, whatever it is. But there needs to be some kind of a unit that everybody can agree with. you don't need to exceed that in a population of 70,000 where people that have got a largesse of money, so that you don't get this big money, big dirty, dark money coming into the politics, and then governments are beholden to these people when they get in, and then they get all the contracts. And the local people don't get anything, and you get so much remittances getting out of the country. And the Dominican people aren't getting paid. So Bernardito, let me just go over to you. So to give me your thoughts on what we're going so far, and your own thoughts on some of that.
Right. Let me say good evening to all my fellow panelists, and of course, good evening to the Dominican public and the Dominican people. As Mr. Jim said, and all the other speakers have said before, it's a very important conversation. I think we have to ensure that this conversation keeps happening. Not only do we have to ensure it keeps happening, we have to own this conversation. We have to own this narrative, because one of the things that you clearly see is the Prime Minister trying to do some sort of judo, where he then tries to grab the moral high ground and tries to control the narrative and tries to position himself as the champion of electoral reform and therefore, by proxy, the champion of democracy. But that is, we know, all of us on this panel clearly knows this is false, but he has a tendency to try to grab the narrative, and we must not allow him that opportunity to do so. That is why these conversations are so important and must continue to happen. We must not allow Roosevelt Skerrit to grab this narrative and to drive it forward, and to essentially pass legislation that has the structure or the appearance, the Wizard of Oz effect of electoral reform, but there is nothing behind the curtain in terms of truly changing the dynamics, as Dr. Andrew said, in terms of leaving open Pandora's box open and for things to occur and keep occurring the way they are. Now, as we've said, as several of the panelists have said, and as we in the Freedom Party states and understands, there are really a few very vital issues. The first issue, and they're different issues, they're separate issues. The first issue is, in fact, registration. I think the legislation and the law is clear that you can register if you have been a resident in the constituency in Dominica for 3 months, if you're a Dominican citizen, 12 months if you're a Commonwealth citizen. If you have met that requirement and you're 18 years of age, you can register. If you're 18 and you're not, you don't have to meet those 3 months just prior to the election period. But it's very clear. You have to be resident in that constituency for 3 months to be able to get on the list. Now, that's clear. That's issue. And the residency, as defined by Dr. Andre, certainly applies. But I think the more ticklish issue is, once you're on that list, what is required for you to remain on that list? Now, the current law says that you have to be, you have to maintain some level of a residence in Dominica, or you will be removed in 5 years from that list. If you're not a resident in Dominica for 5 years, you will be removed from that list. And that is the crux of this most critical issue. What does being resident in Dominica over those 5 years mean? And that is where the definition as applied by Dr. Andre is very relevant. If we say that we define residence as these past legal rulings have ruled, and if we define residence as your primary domicile, where you have established your life, your way of life, where you earn your living, where you educate your children, where you pursue your life goals, then that is the definition of residency that should apply. Therefore, these occasional visits would not apply, would certainly not establish your way of life, your way of earning your living, your way of educating yourself, your way of taking care of your children, your way of paying your taxes, your way of contributing to your community. If we define residency in those terms, then certainly the occasional visit would not qualify, which means the 90-day, 50-day accumulative requirement would not apply if we apply the correct, in my mind, definition of residency. So that's clear. So getting registered is one thing. Staying on the list is another distinct thing that I think is really where we have to focus our attention. Of course, the third thing is the voting process itself. Once you're on the list and you're registered and you have remained registered according to how we define residency, then how do you vote? How is it on voting day? How does that process work? And that, of course, is where things like voter ID cards are important, biometrics are important, technology is important, to ensure that only those who are on the list, a clean, verifiable list, are allowed to vote. And to me, that's a simple matter to implement through voter ID cards and other biometrics and technological means, as we said. The other thing that I think is very important in this process is the role of technology. We are living in this modern age where we're looking at a voters list of, a legitimate voters list, let's say 50,000 people. Such a list, such a database is a trivial matter for technologies. Hundreds of millions of records are processed routinely by most major companies in terms of database maintenance and analysis and analytics and so forth. A 50,000 entry database is a trivial matter. And for us to sit in this day and age and not have the ability to ensure that that list uses technology to analyze the list, to evaluate the list, to make the list available, easily available to the public, why should I need to chase somebody down some coulee in some obscure part of the country to find out if I'm on the list? Because only he has the list printed out, stuck on his kitchen door. In this day and age when this stuff can be made publicly available via websites, and you could have the wisdom of the crowd, look at those lists through social media and other means and websites and say, this person that has not been in Dominica for 30 years, the wisdom of the crowd through our local indigenous knowledge and our close-knit communities can quickly narrow this list down to a legitimate list without much effort. And so using technology to expose, make things transparent, make things quickly updatable, make forms submittable, changes readily implemented, that sort of transparent, modern approach to our electoral list and our electoral reform is something the DFP is very interested in ensuring that those approaches get applied to our voting lists and our voting processes, because those things can move us into the 21st century. So these are the things that we are really focused upon, those principles, ensuring that the Dominicans in Dominica determine their fate. That means we have to find means and mechanisms to ensure that those who reside overseas are not the one deciding the fate of Dominicans. That's a principle. How we get there, the techniques we utilize and so forth, we can debate and we can figure out, but that principle should be front and center. The second principle in my mind is that we do not allow those who have acquired citizenship by various means, most of them unethical or questionable, do not control the fate of Dominicans on our island. That is something, a principle we must keep in our minds. And thirdly, the principle that our process must be transparent, fair, and tamper-proof. And we must use technology, as I said, and other means and principles and ethical approaches to ensure that those things are done. If we can get ways to ensure, and we must ensure, not if, we must ensure that the legislation that passes this year incorporates, embraces, salutes those principles. And if those principles are not incorporated in a legislative framework, then I would say we are missing the mark and we have not accomplished what we should and need to accomplish as opposition forces and as Dominican citizens. So that is the position that we take. That is the things that we are pushing for. And as I said, very importantly, as opposition forces, we cannot allow the current administration to control the narrative. This is our fight. We fought for it, we bled for it, we have appealed for it, we have cajoled in, we have placed Roosevelt Skerrit in a corner where he must now pass this thing. It's at a tipping point created by opposition voices and forces. It is not his agenda. He is placed in a position where he must now pass it. And we must not allow him to do some judo and get out of the corner and pretend to own the narrative. We must continue to press forward.
Oh, thank you so much. Bernard, maybe you want to turn off your mic a little bit because I'm getting a little feedback from somebody's mic here. I'll come back to you again a little bit later, Bernard, but I want to go over now to some of the leaders of the civic organizations. Because I mean, and also to Dr. Dion George after that, because we do have some members of the civic organizations here. I know Sebre McKenzie is here. I wanted to maybe save him for last, unless he wants to go first among the civic organizations. So Sebs, you with me? It doesn't look like we have Severin McKenzie, unless his mic is off. All right. Maybe if your
Okay,
mic
I can go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry?
Washbourne Coffee from CCM.
Go ahead, Washbourne.
Yeah, well, first of all, I will just make a broad statement on behalf of CCM, but Mr. John Blanchard would make some inputs on some of the specific aspects of the report. But first of all, let me say that the Concerned Citizens Movement welcomes the opportunity to make a presentation at this virtual rally on reform, and we thank all persons associated in making this event possible. The Concerned Citizen Movement continues to actively collaborate with the members and affiliates of the Electoral Reform Coalition, the political parties and civil society organizations, to accomplish the objectives of electoral reform and to successfully trigger fresh elections in the Commonwealth of Dominica by mid-2024. In this regard, the Concerned Citizen Movement views this electoral reform rally very timely and of tremendous importance. The Concerned Citizens Movement reiterates that the sham elections of 6 December 2022, without the promised electoral reforms, was indeed an insult and mockery to the people of the Commonwealth of Dominica, a blatant abuse of power, and the blatant rape of Dominica's electoral system. The people's resistance to the sham elections and the actions of the Electoral Reform Coalition resulted in a minority government that undermines and questions the legitimacy and moral existence of the government to continue to hold on to political power and office. The Concerned Citizen Movement therefore calls on all right-thinking citizens to take all necessary action to restore Dominica's good governance and democratic process, and to safeguard the integrity of our electoral process by ensuring free and fair elections, issuance of voter ID cards, cleansing of the voters list, and enforcement of the residency requirement. There is also need for campaign finance reform legislation. Since the involvement of the Concerned Citizens Movement in the electoral reform process, the CCM has placed emphasis on the need for enforcement and implementation as regards to voter ID cards, cleansing of the voters list, and enforcement of the residency requirements. It has been the Concerned Citizen Movement's position that this could have been achieved within the scope of existing legislation. Our emphasis on enforcement and implementation, however, brings into question the role and responsibility of the Electoral Commission. Given that Sir Dennis Byron has submitted his report and draft legislation, the Concerned Citizen Movement supports the call by the Electoral Reform Coalition that the advancement of the electoral reform process depends on the Electoral Commission. We therefore take this opportunity to demand that the Electoral Commission, and in particular the chairman, Mr. Duncan Stowe, and the Chief Elections Officer, to act in the interest of the Dominican public and to immediately circulate the report and recommendations of Mr. Byron and embark on a massive electoral reform education campaign to inform the population of the contents of the Byron report and draft legislation, and to allow for widespread and broad public participation. the Concerned Citizen Movement joins with the Electoral Reform Coalition in calling on the Electoral Commission to recognize its significant role in the delivering of electoral reform to the Dominican public, and request that the Electoral Commission fulfill its constitutional responsibility to bring about free and fair elections and electoral reforms in the shortest possible time frame. The Concerned Citizen Movement reaffirms its commitment and obligation to the resistance and struggle for electoral reform and free and fair elections in the Commonwealth of Dominica. We will continue to collaborate with the Electoral Reform Coalition and its affiliates and the general public to ensure that electoral reform and holding of fresh elections become a reality in the Commonwealth of Dominica. That is our statement. Mr. Blanchard will speak later on to the specifics of some of the concerns as regards to the Byron report.
Very well said, Washbourne. Very well said. I much appreciate it. We do have the civic vibes with us, Loftus Durand. I don't know whether Loftus, you want to make your contribution at this time. Your mic, you want to make sure that your mic is unmuted, huh?
Are you hearing me, Mr. G?
Yes, so we're hearing you very well.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Mr. G. Thank you to the rest of the panel. Protocol already established, so I'll spend very little time on that. Let me just say here, I'm representing a group, a registered group that is called the Civic Vibes. It's a group of men and women, good men and women that is, who came together and trying to ensure that Dominica remains a democratic country. And so I will try my best to represent them tonight in terms of my utterances tonight. But I must say that I will be very measured, but there are sometimes, like tonight, I will give some factual accounts, some situations as it pertains to the truth, as to really how I feel the topic that we're discussing tonight. Basically, just 4 or 5 points to sort of bring, you know, what I want to say to the fore tonight. I personally believe we have been having a lot of conversations on the situation of electoral reform in Dominica, and that in and out of itself is good. And so I want to thank everybody who have joined in that battle, as it were, to continue to voice, to sound the alarm as to where electoral reform is concerned in Dominica. Basically, that in my mind is just making Dominica a freer and fairer place where we conduct our elections. But in my mind, I must add to say here that much lip service have been given to that situation, and not much sacrifice has been given as well to back up the talk. And so sometimes it laments me as a human rights and social rights activist. It really plagues me to see that we continue to talk about the situation in Dominica, and when we are called upon as a citizenry now to back up those talk with action, some of us, we stay at the back and try to clap on those who are at the forefront. Personally, again, I hear us talking tonight about an electoral commission. In my mind, this electoral commission, headed by Duncans to now, it's a lame duck. It's a toothless tiger, if you ask me. We have seen that commission at work, and personally, I expect nothing more from that commission, because on that commission, as I said, I'll be very truthful tonight to my feelings. Duncan's store is a passport, somebody involved in the passport business. Let me be very cool about it. We have the two other commissioners appointed by the government side. They too, they are part and parcel of the passport selling business in Dominica. And so we Dominicans should be fooling ourselves to expect anything less from these people, as Irving Andre said a while ago, who have the veto power to do anything to bring some kind of solution to what we have been clamoring about for years. And hence I say, the sacrifice that is needed, some of us are not prepared to go down that road to make that kind of extra sacrifice that is needed. Right here before me, people, I have a statement of Duncan's too, which I will let you guys here in the public hear. It's about 30 seconds, not too long, where he gave the Dominican people his commitment of doing the work for and on behalf of the people. And all of us know, if we deep down in our conscience, Duncan's too he did and his commission very little in terms of backing up his words.
I am humbled by the confidence reposed in me by His Excellency, the President, to serve as Chairman of the Electoral Commission for this present term. I am aware of the Herculean task ahead. However, I am ready to undertake the challenges that come with this job. I pray God that I do not disappoint the people as I seek to perform my duties to the best of my abilities. I think at this time, I'll take a pause and wait for my feet to be wet as I take up the task.
All right, people, that was Duncan's to October 2022. If we listen to that statement properly and analyze that statement against the function of Duncan's too and the commission which he leads, I hope we can come up with honest answers. Finally, gentlemen and people out there, I am of the firm view that a fully grown tree can never be gotten rid of so easily when it is fully grown. And the Dominican Labour Party in government today, after 20-something years, politically, they are fully grown and they are entrenched. And I will spare no effort to say, if we, the Dominican people, choose not to do the sacrificing that I spoke of before, then the democracy that we hold so dear to, it will be surely be evading us every day. And as Trilogy said in his song, it will be moving away from us. So guys, I don't want to be the prophet of doom and gloom, but the way that this Labour Party has entrenched itself on its people in Dominica, if something drastic doesn't happen in Dominica, then this tree that I spoke of before, which represents the Dominican Labour Party, is either we cut it down or we burn it down, figuratively speaking, that is. If we don't do that, we must be prepared to turn our talk into action, and that is active action. It may just be some of us, our blood may have to be given like our forefathers before, Bala, Congo, and the others in the defense of Dominica. I rest, Mr. G.
Yeah, thank you, Loftus. But just before I let you go, you see what I'm saying here, we're trying to arrive at some consensus of some big ticket items. And I think you did hear the discussion. You did hear Dr. Irving Andre, you did hear Mr. James talk about the question of registration and the question of residency. I'm taking it that you are going along, you're accepting those arguments, and that in terms of the big ticket items. I'm also gathering that you are saying, although Dr. Andre will guide us on that, nobody seems to be satisfied with the way the Electoral Commission is currently constituted. And I think I did indicate earlier, I think it should be revisited and it should be expanded to include civil society representation in this so that it is not subject to manipulation or the whims and fancies of the political directorate or people who want to be authoritarian or dictatorial. So I'm assuming that you agree that, but we'll refer to Dr. Andre later on that matter, because I get a sense, Dr. Andre, and you'll guide us later on that it may require a constitutional amendment. I'm not so sure, in order to reconstitute that Electoral Commission. I'm not sure if it is cast in stone in the law that it has to be the way it is 2, 2, and 1, you know, so we'll have to take a look at that. And finally, Loftus, I gather what you're saying, which is what I asked the question in my opening remarks. Is it going to be required to have mass gatherings of large numbers of people? And Mr. James referred to it in order to make the demand that people are serious about getting electoral reform. I think you seem to be saying that is something that might be required.
That to me, Mr. G, is one of the only way out now where we are at this juncture. I have lived in Dominica a little while now and see the Dominica Labour Party in operation. And mere words now, I'm not saying it cannot help, they cannot help, but I think the words need some sort of more active action on the ground to basically solidify the efforts for country.
All right, thanks a lot, Loftus. I think we're arriving at some consensus going forward, which I hope that Electoral Reform Coalition can use and put some kind of language into that and create a position paper. Let me just go over to Dr. Dion George. I'll see who else is with us later that we can go to. Dr. Dion George, let's get some comments from you on what you've heard so far and what you think the kind of consensus areas that we seem to be arriving at.
Okay, good evening, Mr. Gregoire. Thank you for inviting me on this salient issue tonight of electoral reform and the way forward for Dominica's election. I think most of the panelists, and let me say good evening to the panelists, good evening to the people of Dominica. But as always, I always want to invoke the spirit of the Creator himself, who gives all wisdom, that what our activity tonight will do will bring knowledge, wisdom, and it would be for the betterment of our country and our people. Sila. So with that being said, I think my contribution as a political scientist is simply to give a cursory review of some of the points that some of the previous panelists made, and I won't repeat it, but just to give my twist to what I think has transpired and where we are going. And so essentially, without any further ado, I think when one speaks of electoral reform, we are speaking of making our election process better. That's all it is. And of course, we're making it better because we want it to be free and fair. And so, of course, Sir Dennis Byron has been charged with a responsibility to mandate some sort of recommendations moving forward. And of course, QFM and the Global View and Q has championed discussions on that sort. Needless to say, in the beginning, we all were what I would call originalists of a constitution, that we held the view that the Electoral Commission of the country, as constituted by the Constitution, was required to make those rules. In fact, in Mr. Byron's utterances and in his review, he acknowledged the fact that the Constitution of Dominica and some other areas of that document, including the House of Assembly Election Act and the Registration Election Act, is capable of dealing with that. And so my contribution tonight, I will just talk on some of his main points. Initially, the concern came about that he recognized, that is Sir Dennis Byron, the view that since 2004, the government of Dominica has invited elections observers to Dominica. And he acknowledged that there have been some reports. Incidentally, however, he notes that some of these recommendations have not been implemented. He, in his preliminary report, noted that there were two major issues, which was, of course, the recommendations for identifications card and the revision of the electoral registrations. He noted that it was accepted by the major party in power, but he also said that the opposition party disagreed with some of the positions, and almost in 2019, it became almost violent disgust. And so he gave his recommendations, and he said that the country in 2019 had two main issues that was needed to be dealt with, which included the need for identification card and the need for voters list re-registration. So there were two main objectives. Now, I will say as a disclaimer, I have and recently been working with the election, and if the viewers can see, I have a card there right now, which I was a manager at a precinct dealing with elections, especially in the state of Georgia, where there were some issues about they are saying that there are dead people on the voters list, which, if I may call his name, the good old Donald Trump said that was the issue. And so, of course, Dominica have that same issue. And so I will give credit to Mr. Byron that he said that there is no election manager or persons who draft legislation that are indiscriminate to criticism, i.e., that the whole idea of electoral reform is an ongoing process. I will tell the public what are some of the key major objectives of his mandate, i.e., what was he hired for. One of it was that, one, that he should conduct and review the results of the public consultations and advise on changes to improve the electoral process in Dominica. He was also charged with the responsibility to review and advise the provisions for advice on provisions for eligibility to vote, including the use of identification cards for the purpose of voting, and whether the law ought to also provide other and additional methods of identification in keeping with the constitutional right to vote. And one of the other one I chose was that, obviously there are others, but with the interest of time, I just want to touch on a few important ones that I think I want to comment on, was to advise the best process for maintaining the updated electoral register that will not result in repudiation of the right to vote and slash or were to disenfranchise legitimate voters. So those were some of the charges that he was mandated to do. Now, I did do some research today, and I was unsuccessful to find out within the Caribbean region, other countries that seek to employ a third stakeholder as a luminary, as Justice Byron. But of course, I know Dr. Andre and others may have evidence that it has happened before. But I checked on the United States Federal Election Commission and have not seen evidence of that. I say that to the point that I initially, and even today, have been fundamentally clear that I believe that our laws have catered for and is able to deal with the issue of elections in Dominica. Nonetheless, in Mr. Byron's report, which I can give credit to, he explained the rationale for his employment and his engagement. He said that he took some actions, and I will name them numerically. He said, number one, he had to review the existing electoral laws and electoral amendments and bills. He said he had to analyze past reports from the OAS and CARICOM and other observers. And he said his reason for doing so was to make sure that if there are similarities in his findings and to confirm whether or not any of the recommendations were in the past recommended, and if so, have they been implemented? He also said that part of his duty was to review the relevant constitutional and legislative framework. My dear friends, what he meant by that is that he would look at Dominica Constitution, and he specifically said in the Constitution of Dominica, if one were to ask a question, what part of Dominica Constitution that deals with electoral laws, he mentioned Section 38 and Section 56, and anyone can go online and get it. He also mentioned other documents, including the Electors Act, the registration of electors regulation. And he said also that he reviewed existing reports from the recommended groups. He further went on to say that he conducted some research. Now, in terms of the actual report itself, I just want to give a synopsis of that. He said there were two main parts. The first part he called phase one, which is what we are discussing tonight, which would include the cleaning up of the electoral list with emphasis on voter identification. The second part would deal with the electoral process, which interestingly I'm excited about, which deals with campaign financing, to which he said it's not a clear issue. In fact, I will jump ahead and I will tell you part of his report. He said that there is no constitutional underpinning within the Constitution of Dominica that deals with campaign finance reform. However, he did went further and said that phase one of the report will address the preliminary issues and propose legislation for re-registration of electors. And so that's what we're talking about tonight. Incidentally, however, and subsequently, he said that phase two will deal and will address some institutional matters regarding electoral commission and the proposed laws and how it will be implemented. I do want to say that he was sort of, I would say, consultory with his report. He said that the government had to provide some allowance for a modification of his mandate, which means that they had to change his original contract, and invited a lady by the name of Dr. Beverly Pierre to help with the drafting of some of the main drafts for the new legislation, to the effect that any amendment would have not sufficed. Furthermore, I will pause at this point and I will defer with some of my panelists, and I will give credit, not perhaps holistically, but in terms of the effect of the Electoral Commission in Dominica. I've listened to the Hot Seat and to Talk on the Block and several other programs, even the Global View on Q, sometimes where it seems to me that some members of the Electoral Commission had came under some fire. But in Dennis Byron report, he claimed that there were robust discussions during consultations, so much so that some members of the Electoral Commission noted the idea of the fact that 2 members are chosen from the opposition and 2 members are chosen from the incumbent government, and that 1 is chosen by the president. And so if there had to be a vote, it seemed that might have delayed the process, and that they wanted his input as perhaps an icebreaker or something of that sort, and to which he agreed. And so I think that was a good point and a good strategy by the Electoral Commission of Dominica. But before I bring this sort of cursory review to an end, I would like to insert some of my own views.
Yeah, but let me just insert something here so that you can incorporate that in your views there, Dion. Now that the report is actually in, the recommendations are in, and we noticed that Dr. Andre and former Prime Minister Edison James, both, they looked at these 2 big ticket items of the re-registration in Dominica and the question of residency. In your remarks there, you might want to say whether in fact you are in agreement with the approach that they're taking on those 2 big ticket items, because to me, these are the two essential things that you yourself have outlined coming out of that report, those two things. So maybe in your remarks there, you might want to make a comment as to, because we're trying to arrive at a consensus before we leave here as to some of those big ticket items.
Okay, good. Well, I will have to cut my little presentation there in short, but I did wanted to say one last thing before I go to those two questions. The fact that the OAS made some recommendations, of course, and of course that the Caribbean Court of Justice did mention the fact that it remains that with grave concern that after the 2019 election, that Dominica should not have an election before those changes were made. Obviously, the report said, so that Dennis Byron said he was surprised of the election. But to your question directly, as I wrap up, is this. The issue of residency, I believe, is within the Constitution of Dominica. We have dealt with many shows where I've demonstrated, I have quoted the Constitution or the document that deals with it. The issue that comes about, it's a little gray, and I would suggest it needs some refining. Yes, it talks about a resident is one who stays within a place, and if he works, he comes back and live in that place, etc. I think that's very clear. The issue that brings the gray area, I would submit, is the area where it says if you live overseas for 5 years and you can come back and vote. Now, what that caters for is someone can come back for a weekend within that 5 years and then they can vote. I think that's where the gray area is. So that's one area I would suggest that needs a little revision, which I think that can be addressed. And what was the other one, Mr. Gregoire?
Well, the other area was the question of the re-registration in Dominica. I mean, the consensus seemed to be that people should come back to get re-registered in Dominica. And if you re-register everybody, then that will automatically remove all the dead people from the list because people actually come and register.
Okay, thank you for reminding me. Well, re-registration obviously is part of the electoral reform, but I will also hasten to say that, and I want to make it very clear, that the laws of Dominica, and hear me loud and clear, caters for non-citizens of Dominica to vote in Dominica. So much so, according to the report, that if you're a Commonwealth member of the region and you live in Dominica for a certain amount of time, before a certain amount of months, maybe 3 months, and you have been registered, that you can vote in Dominica, even if you're not a Dominican citizen. So re-registration will always be an ongoing process. I rest my case.
And you're quite right. Re-registration is always going to be, it has to be ongoing all the time because people are going to turn 18 all the time. And then once they get to be 18, they get to register, they're allowed to register to vote, right? So I think this is quite good. Now, we have a couple of other people here with us, and we really would like to hear from them because afterwards, we really want to take some calls from our listeners. I know there are people listening and watching on Facebook and on YouTube and so on who would like to make some calls. And I also have to go back to Dr. Thompson Fontaine and certainly Mr. Sever because I have not been able to ascertain whether Sever McKenzie is still with us. But let me go over to Johnson. Is Sever, are you there? Oh, Sever, you're there. Okay, because I tried to reach you earlier, but I couldn't get you. Would you like to make a contribution now? Or would we like to save you for the last?
I could. Good evening, Mr. G. Maybe I could give my 2 little cents.
Okay.
Let me say good evening to the panelists, and let me thank everybody for participating in this forum this evening. I want to be as short as possible because quite a bit has been said. But I would like to maybe begin by saying that the electoral laws are for the benefit of all Dominicans in spite of their political party colors. But unfortunately, we have seen that politics has desecrated the electoral process to the extent that it is presently used as a tool to the advantage of those who hold the reins of power. And those who do not hold the reins of power are looking at it as a tool to see how they could get in power. And this is not what the population, to my mind, is much concerned about. Unfortunately, I would say that the electoral reform process is at a critical juncture right now, because after all those years of agitation and people demonstrating and protesting for electoral reform, I think we are the closest to getting to have it for the Commonwealth of Dominica getting some type of electoral reform. However, it is actually going to depend on what type of electoral reform that we will get, because the way it is going right now, it does not appear that we are getting much consensus in people agreeing. And if it continues the way that it is, it would mean that when this legislation goes to Parliament, one side is going to be aggrieved and the other side going to rejoice. And the question that I would like to ask is, does the Commonwealth of Dominica have people that we consider to be respectable, who we can trust to look at those electoral laws and objectively arrive at some type of solution to the impasse that we face?
I can answer that question. Irving and Andre can do that for us.
Thank you, Mr. G, for at least identifying one. But I think this is maybe the way that we have to go, because people have to recognize that the electoral legislation, which is basically the base or the most important aspect of electoral reform, because if there is no electoral legislation, revised electoral legislation to change the laws as it exists, then there is no electoral reform. So the electoral reform process actually depends on the revised legislation. And I think we should be pleased that Sir Dennis Byron took one step away from just preparing a report, because what we had seen in the past is quite a number of reports being prepared by a whole set of people, including ourselves, the Electoral Reform Group of 2019, who came up with a report. But it has gone one step further to have right now the draft legislation, which is a very positive step. And it is, the onus, I think, is on the population right now to demand that they see and learn and educate themselves on what is the content of this draft legislation, where we can have some level of consultation and where you can have some level of discussion, where you can arrive at some type of consensus to say that this is the legislation that is going to Parliament. Because one of the things that actually keeps the whole process in the situation that it is that there is a lack of trust. So there is a lack of trust on the part of the people who support the opposition. They do not trust the government will actually go to Parliament with legislation that will satisfy them. And there is lack of trust on the part of the people who support the government that any changes that the opposition would recommend would be suspicious. So this is why we are where we are, we are as far as the East is from the West. So I believe that the Electoral Commission, which when the writers of our Constitution inserted them as a constitutional authority for the Commonwealth of Dominica, and decided that they would have 2 members of the opposition supporting maybe one party and 2 members of the government supporting another party, would be neutralized with 1 person who is impartial. They thought that we could really maybe end up with somebody who was impartial and who would actually look at, and he would actually be a referee or an arbiter between the thing. And they never actually, I do not believe that they anticipated that they were creating a situation where you would have a 3-2 division all along. So with this, with the composition of the Electoral Commission as it is now, maybe the time has come when, for the sake of the nation, that the Electoral Commission maybe should incorporate as a group of Dominicans who can be a bit objective to assist in putting this thing together with national consultation where people's views can be expressed. And it has been done before. I do not know if you remember Mr. G, and maybe Mr. James would take credit for it, that when the question of constitutional review came up in the late 1990s, Mr. Telford Judges, who was, I think, the chairman of the Constitutional Review Committee, conducted widespread consultations throughout the country, and every Tom, Dick, and Harry had an opportunity to talk about the constitutional changes that were required. That was way back in the 90s. So for the electoral reform process, I think the laws are there, and what people, I mean, it's unfair. And I think for me personally, I consider it unfair that we did quite a bit of work. We did quite a bit of work in the whole electoral reform process. And we would, when I was the chairman of the Dominica Business Forum, we were the only civil society organization that engaged Sir Byron in a consultation.
Let me ask you this, Sebs. Would you say that some of the work that was done by your group, it was a very substantial work, it's very substantial recommendation. Would you say that some of those recommendations, some of that would found their way into Sir Dennis Byron's report and his recommendations?
This was the point I was actually coming to. After doing all this work and after meeting Sir Dennis Byron, you wouldn't believe that we have not been graced with a copy of the report of Sir Dennis Byron report, neither the draft legislation for the bill, so that we could actually look at, which I think it is unfortunate. But my point is, I'm not talking on behalf, I'm no longer the chairman of the Business Forum, but my point is that I think that the report and the draft legislation must be circulated right across the country, that people should have access to it, get themselves knowledgeable about it, and then the consultations begin so that we could actually arrive at solving some of the gray areas that still exist.
So
without that, I believe that this whole electoral thing is
my
going
question
right
to
back
you,
to square one. Those who have
my question to you says,
my
question to you really says was, I mean, have you seen the report at all on the law? Because I mean,
no, I've not seen the law at all.
Not seen it at all. Okay. But I don't know whether you listen to Dr. Andre and Mr. James and the other folks there, and some of the comments that they made with regard to the question of re-registration and the question of residency. It seems to me that some of that obviously must have been part of some of your recommendations. So I don't know.
Yeah, but the thing that I have, and it goes back right now to trust. Who can you trust these days in being the ones to tell you what was in the report without seeing it yourself? Okay. So yes, Dr. Andre, I believe that he made a very commendable thing. I also respect Mr. James in clarifying quite a number of things. But at the same time, as a person with my own brain, I think I would be much more comfortable seeing the report myself and being able to read it, satisfy myself, and then to say, yes, I agree with what Dr. Andrew said or what Mr. James said, instead of they having to tell me what is in the report. And I think this is what should apply to every Dominican, whether they choose to read it or not. But those of us who are interested in seeing the report, and I believe the report has to come from a credible source, because why I say that? With all the technologies and tampering and plagiarism and all those things that exist these days, you get a report and you can never even be sure that this is the real report. So we should be getting a report that comes from a credible source that's certified, that could say, yes, this is the report that Sir Byron really thinks, and it is not, it is untampered with.
Okay, I see what you're saying, but I think I absolutely agree with you that there needs to be consultation. But I do believe that we're closer to arriving at some consensus on some of those issues after I've listened to Dr. Andre and I've listened to Mr. James, who both, I'm pretty sure, may have read those reports, and I trust them. And I take I take it at heart when Dr. Andre makes certain recommendations. And he's not a man who's going to do things willy-nilly. He'll study. And Mr. James does not do that either. He will study the thing and then make recommendations. I believe that we're getting closer, and I think that it was a good thing that Dennis Byron presented that report. And I'm pretty sure that report includes some of the recommendations that came from the business forum, and certainly from what I've read in it, certainly, and I'm happy that we're arriving at some consensus on some of those things, and we're moving closer to that. I don't know whether we want to go quickly. Is Johnson Boston, you're with us? I don't know.
Yes, I'm there.
Boss, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
All right. Your thoughts?
Well, I think you have a very good panel here tonight, and I think they all have spoken with wisdom on the issue, because we're all citizens, whether you're red, green, blue, whatever, ought to be on the same page when it comes to doing the right thing for our country. And earlier on, somebody mentioned the question of parliament, that none of the major parties are in parliament, but the parliament belong to, in the opposition are in parliament, but the parliament belong to us as citizens. And when you are in there, you're not in there in your own private house, you're in the house of the nation. And I think when something good comes before the parliament, we ought to debate it and take up the partisanship from it and really get consensus to make it work in the best interest of the citizens. I think we have been on this road for a long time, many years ago, and we have made an effort from all angles to ensure that we have this reform, because at the end of the exercise, when the election is conducted and result is given, you want to be able to complement the side who are successful and let us patch up and unite and move on in this our country. The way things have happened for the past elections, it's like you never feel settled and satisfied that you had a good election. Apart from the MIPU and the name calling and the vilification, the result always scares you as to whether you have the kind of people in power that are focused on the right thing for the country. So I am calling on those in parliament to work with those of us outside of show that what is right is done, no matter what side you are in parliament, because we want at the end of the day to get the right thing done. I haven't seen the report myself, but what I'm hearing in the report, a number of things there that we can agree upon. And I think as we go forward, we need to stay closer, take ownership of it as a country, and ensure that no one person or group hijack this thing and do it in their way. It must be done at the end of the day. It is not a labor thing, a freedom thing, a workers thing. It is a Dominican thing. Because you may be in government now and enjoying power, yes, fine, but there comes a time when you've not been power. And earlier on, we talked about the members of the commission. The spirit was that the government nominated two, recommend two for nomination for appointment, and the opposition two, and the president put the fifth person there. The idea was when you get in there, whether your party put you there or not, you become professional and you do the work in a professional way. And what we have seen the last couple of years is that we have seen a real struggle and battle with persons who are not there with the right intention and so forth. And I just want to say that we have to support those who are really want to get the thing done and get it done properly. So to just end it by saying that I think you have a good panel and they have hit the head on the nail. And I think at the end of the day, we have to stay in the struggle, stay there and keep it going and ensure that if we cannot get it as a country, we have to take it, because the country is not governed for one set of people, it's governed for all people. And we all have to be law-abiding citizens, obey the law, but people cannot rob us from our right to participate freely in our democracy. Thank you very much.
And thanks a lot for that also. Is John Blanchard, you with us? I don't know whether John is with us. John, if you're with us, if you want to say something, you might want to turn off open up your mic. It doesn't look like John is with us. All right, listen, what I wanted to do, Lambi, I wanted to go over to you. I want to just open up the discussion now, all of our panelists, so that they can, participate. Because there's a number of questions that have arisen. I know that Mr. Jameson and Dr. Andrew will be able to help with some of those things. And I certainly hope that Thompson Fountain, Dr. Fountain is still with us. I know it's a really a godforsaken hour in his neck of the woods right now, and I don't want to impose on him too much, but maybe if he's still awake and he might be able to join us in the further conversation as we go along. But Lambi, would you give the folks the numbers and so that you can make me a sign when the calls start coming in, so we can just interrupt ourselves and take their calls.
Thanks. You're tuned to the Global View and Q. The numbers are 449-3095, 449-3096, 449-3097, 616-4257, 305-432-9624. Let me run those numbers again. 449-3095, 449-3096, 449-3097, 616-4257, 305-432-9624. And we already have a call on the line. So caller, please go ahead.
Yes, good evening, gentlemen. Very good program.
Good evening.
Something I heard about the re-registration, residency requirements, and all this. But something I observed last election, not that one, when the 2019, the night of the writ, people were registering on places that doesn't exist at all. So I have a problem with that when people come down here and they haven't got an address per se. They could be living with a friend, and they can also register on that friend's home. Because I saw that happen in 2019. A young lady came to register to vote because we were out that night. But the person she came with knew me. So the person kind of moved away from her and let the guy go inside with her to register. So next day, I did my investigation. I got the person name and I did my investigation. I asked the lady daughter, how many of you living in that house? She told me my brother, my sister, myself, my mother, and my mother boyfriend. So I asked her, do you have so-and-so living inside here with you? She told me no. That's her mother's friend who came to visit. And she registered on that address. So that is another problem we have when come to registering. Them people not going to just, them people actually just shouldn't happen, and people come from away and they re-registering, they have to have a permanent address in the country. You can't just come by me and spend 3 months with me or 6 months with me and you're going to register on my address where you do food. That shouldn't happen. Have a blessed night, gentlemen. I'm listening.
And have a blessed night yourself as well.
We have another caller on the overseas line. Good evening, caller. Go ahead, please.
Thank you.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, caller, you got the noise in the background. Go ahead, please.
Yes.
Well,
are you paying attention? Mr. G, go ahead, please.
All right, Dr. Andre, and let me go back to you because, you know, a number of issues have been raised, but I think we need to focus. Really, there are two big ticket items that yourself and Mr. James have raised there. You know, with the question of the re-registration in Dominica. and the question of the re-registration, and the other one was the residency, right? And somebody raised an issue with me a while ago, and I believe both you and Mr. James, when we come to, discuss, we'll resolve that. But somebody raised a question to me, and you mentioned it a little earlier, about the people who are the passport holders, the CBI residents. And frankly, they're citizens because they have passports, but I don't think they should just be able to vote in Dominica just because they bought a passport. But certainly if they were to satisfy the residency requirements, if they're resident in Dominica, investing in Dominica and living in Dominica, what would your thoughts be on that? And Mr. James might want to chime in on that as well.
Yeah, well, again, Sir Byron recommended that to the extent that these CBI citizens reside in Dominica in a particular constituency for 3 months preceding an election, that he or she should be eligible to vote. Now, Mr. James said something which I don't dispute, that as a precondition to re-registration, we must have a clear conception as to the definition of residency. Now, here is a section of analogous legislation in St. Kitts. St. Kitts has a piece of legislation called Election Registration Regulations. Here's what Section 5 says, quote, "The place of ordinary residence of a person is generally that place which has always been or which he or she has adopted as his or her habitation or home, whereof when away from there, he or she intends to return." So if you're coming to Dominica for 1 weekend after getting a free passage, how can you be resident in Dominica, Gasson? That is not the place where you are habitually resident. So to the extent that our legislation does not have a similar provision, then it should stipulate so expressly. But again, I maintain the legislation as it stands is no different from that which obtains in other islands. And in other islands, there is no equivocation, there's no difficulty about the meaning. But for preciseness, to the extent that our legislation doesn't have a similar provision, then it should have. It should state so expressly. With respect to the constitution or the way in which the Electoral Commission is constituted, 2-2-1, we only have a problem because of the toxic partisanship in Dominica right now. We only have a problem because one side believes that with the blessing of St. Thomas, they should be in office in perpetuity. That's why we have this problem. It has always been that way, but it has never been so blatantly political as it is now. So when the constitution or the whatever it is gives the president the discretion in his own deliberate judgment, what a sham. Huh? In his own independent judgment, the purpose of that type of wording is to ensure that at least this person will have the integrity to basically deal with any deadlock in terms of any decision the Electoral Commission has to make. The framers of this legislation didn't believe that this fellow, appointed by the president in so-called his own deliberate judgment, would jump in bed with the other two government side appointees. We didn't contemplate, because it's a blatant conflict of interest, that as one of the callers said, I believe it's Lofty, these folks allegedly all are passport sellers, so they have an interest in maintaining the status quo. Nobody anticipated that we would arrive at that level of duplicity, of complicity, of dishonesty. And therein lies the problem. So it's not the 2-2-1 that is the problem per se. It's the corruption of the whole process. And that's why it's imperative that with the perpetuation of that mentality, as much as things change, they will always remain the same. There's a French version for it, but go and ask somebody who speaks French. Don't ask me, I don't know. So that is where we are in, because the whole process has been corrupted to such a terrible extent. Lofty delivered a sobering assessment. It's an inconvenient truth but that is the reality that we face as we speak. You know, the intent for legitimate electoral reform doesn't exist in official circles. What exists is a mentality to perpetuate the power or the party in power, quite frankly, and any electoral reform they embrace will be one which will facilitate that, nothing else. If we think that somehow that what Sir Byron will propose will mean a shift in paradigm, I love Santa Claus. And Humpty Dumpty, as I said, he had a great fall.
Mr. James, you wanted to add something else to this? I don't know whether Mr. James is hearing me. Your mic on?
He's muted.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead.
Yeah, Sheridan. Yeah, on the question of residency, I think I'm on the same wavelength with all the residency requirements, what it should be. I think I'm on the same wavelength as Dr. Andre.
Okay.
So I do not agree that we should leave the legislation as is. The legislation as is provides for, here what it provides for. It provides for the removal of a name. With residency, as I said earlier, it speaks about being resident in a polling district for 90 days to qualify to be registered. That's okay. The problem we have is with respect to the removing the names of persons who are resident overseas, okay? And so the definition as articulated by Dr. Andre, I think is appropriate, but we would have to change the provision in the law, which as it stands now, provides for your name to be removed from the list as a Dominican if you have been absent from Dominica for a period exceeding 5 years. And you know what happens here is that people come back, as I said earlier, in a day, for 2 days, and then it means that they were not absent for 5 years, and they've been taking advantage of that. And you know, it's interesting, you know, that Mr. Byron, in his report, he says here, interesting comment. During our consultations, there were representations that the governing party was much better funded than other political parties, and that they used money to bring voters to Dominica in numbers large enough to influence the outcome of an election. And so that might very well be what is guiding this position, which clearly is coming from the government side, the Labour Party, with respect to this residency, because that is the source of the people who come in here to contaminate the election, okay? So that definition has to be, as indicated by Dr. Andre, and an amendment made to the new legislation should include this. So I was going to say, Sheridan, I don't know whether I'll have another chance, but Mr. Byron's role, as he told us, is advisory. It's advisory. He's advising. As he consults, he would have listened to a number of sides, all sides, and he would try to get, in some cases, a middle of the road position or something like that. So his role has been advisory. It is the responsibility of us now to direct what we want, what we see as best practice, what we need. So in this regard, notwithstanding what Dr. Byron has recommended, then I think the population needs to be guided in the direction of speaking to what they want as residency, okay? We love our brothers and sisters overseas and so on, but we are saying, let the residency have to do with what residency really means. So the confirmation process should be done in Dominica. Registration, as it is now, is done in Dominica. Voting is done in Dominica. The proposal here for confirmation, I would say, let it be done in Dominica. Mr. Byron has left it open. He has indicated what he was getting from different people. But he says that, look, I'm leaving this, I recognize that this may change, and I'm seeking to get guidance from you as to whether I should leave in the recommendation this proposal with respect to, I think it is the 90-day thing, okay? So we need to deal with that. I also want to caution against the time frame. Gentlemen, Mr. Skerrit and the Mr. Skerrit, because Mr. Skerrit is the only one speaking on electoral reform on the government side. He's the only one on the Labour Party side. I noticed he said that Mr. Darrow was appointed to play some role in this electoral from reform process. We've not heard anything from Mr. Darrow. It's only Mr. Skerrit we are hearing. So I don't think he or anybody would argue that he does not have a galloping interest in seeing this electoral reform happening. And we've seen all kinds of machinations and stumbling blocks being put in its way. I mean, we know of the famous 2008 email, which Tony Astafan, who Skerrit said speaks for him anytime, said, if you allow electoral reform, your winning legacy will be damaged, or words to that effect. I believe Mr. Skerrit believes that. So we've seen delaying tactic. I believe the delaying tactics is reflected in the fact that we did not have the legislation dealing with registration passed in the parliament in January, in keeping with the recommendation of Byron. We are hearing Mr. Skerrit grumbling about the CCJ and what the CCJ report is. He has made noise with, as we put in local parlance with Sir Dennis, for including a reference to the CCJ's decision or observation in the report, okay? So we're now hearing that Mr. Skerrit is talking about experts coming in to lead the public consultation. My God, that is not, that's undesirable. The scope of work, the terms of reference you gave Mr. Byron, the eminent jurist, provided for widespread consultation. He has listed all the consultations he's had, you know? So it is a delaying tactic to be talking about now bringing in experts. These experts came in already, they made recommendations, those were thrown aside. So it's a delay tactic, and we must be careful about that, okay? It's clear, the fingerprints, the clean up the list, these are things that we articulated about. They are supposed, they're in the recommendations. I would say, and as I said earlier, the Electoral Commission, notwithstanding what the real position is, that it can act only on the basis of legislation, of laws which have been passed in the parliament. There are laws now which is acting under, there are new laws that are being proposed. When those are concretized and passed in the parliament, they will have a legal constitutional obligation to implement those. But that doesn't mean that they cannot now be involved in an education process. I think this question about the report, my friend, I would say, I heard the report being played on your station, Mr. Gregoire, so everybody can hear it. I have a copy of the report. Other people have a copy of the report. I suspect you have. Let us circulate it. Let us circulate it. It's not Mr. Skerrit's property. It's not the Labour Party's property. It's not Europe's property. Let us circulate it. And let us engage groups, citizens groups around the country, whether it's church groups, whether it's women's groups, youth groups, farmers groups. Let us find the 3 or 4 people who have made themselves au fait and au courant with the details of these recommendations and what we want, and engage around the country, the village councils, let them engage people and let the consultation and discussion go on with respect to the recommendation. And what we should be telling them is that do not allow this thing to continue to be delayed. April is the deadline for the legislation. 6 months after that, the electoral process should be, re-registration process should be completed and ready for elections in the first quarter, the first half of next year.
Okay, excellent. Dr. Andre, I'll come back to you in a little while so you can tell us.
Yeah, could I maybe say something?
Hold on 1 second. I just want to say to Dr. Andre that I'll come back to him in a minute to talk about the amendment that Mr. James was talking about. But before I come to you, Washby, I wanted to see if Dr. Fontaine is with us. Dr. Fontaine, are you with us? Because he hasn't had a chance to contribute in any significant way yet. Well, I'm not sure that he's with us. So maybe Dr. Fontaine is not with us. So Washby, go right ahead. Go ahead, Washby.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I'm hearing you, yes.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to give support to what was being said by Mr. James, because we have come to learn and understand the semantics of the Prime Minister in this whole process. I mean, the Prime Minister, I think, has a vexation going back to since the early demonstration years ago. about, that putting back electoral reform and all what he has done ever since. Even though he has made certain disclosures that he seemed to be interested and whatnot, but we know all that is semantics. We have come now not to be able to trust this guy in this matter. And this is where the point raised by Loftus was, I think, still very relevant. Because while we recognize the need for the circulation of the report and the consultative process, but if we have to leave this thing and rely on the government, we know we're not going to get this thing. We will have to take whatever action is going to be necessary that we can ensure that we achieve this electoral process. So I think we need to be mindful that the government is not acting in good faith. They have never done and they never will. And I mean, we are well aware of some of the reasons. They want to maintain the status quo, So we as a people, and this is why we made the call that all right-thinking people need to come together and to take ownership of this process, as Mr. James is suggesting. We cannot leave it to the politicians. We, the citizens, have to put ourselves in a position to say, this is important to our country. This is important for the integrity of our election, to safeguard our democracy. And we as a people going to make sure that we sideline Mr. Sheridan and get the work done. And that is where I think we should be shifting some focus to, given what Loftus suggested, that we have to be prepared to take whatever drastic action. It's not just going to be given like this. So that is the point I want to re-emphasize.
Well, thank you so much for that, Washbourne. Bernard, any further thoughts on this? So if you're with us, Bernard, I mean, and you can unmute your mic, you might want to make a further contribution there because, any further thoughts?
I mean, I think we all align that it's not going to be an easy path, and that simply speaking, in formal settings is probably not sufficient. Not probably, definitely is not sufficient. And I think that we do have to get the community meetings going. We do have to get the motivation going. We do have to move the crowd. We have to find a way to reach people emotionally, get them in those rallies, get them on the streets, get them in the forums. We have to create enough energy and human movement around this issue to convince the government that we mean business and that the legislation that is tabled and passed has to address the issues that we're concerned about. And so I agree generally. I mean, unless that movement happens, we probably will not get anything that's satisfying. And so I think we all aligned on that. I think we have to find ways to organize, motivate, and get people emotionally connected to the issue and get them to understand that it's a fight for the soul of Dominica, not simply electoral reform, but a fight for the soul of our island, a fight for our future. If we lose this battle, Dominica is in dire straits. And so we have to make that message clear to people and get them to emotionally react to that.
Thank you, Bernard. Dr. Andre, I wanted you to maybe make a further comment because you see, I'm really trying to zero down on those two big ticket items, the question of the residency and the re-registration. But I think we're getting some consensus, as Bernard said, on this. Your thoughts, because Mr. James was saying that a little tweak needs to be made to that provision there so that it clarifies the question of residency in the way that you yourself defined it in terms of the case law of St. Kitts, I think it was. So over to you, Dr. Andre. Your mic is muted though.
Yes, absolutely. Again, because the excuse has been that there is some ambiguity in Dominican laws insofar as that phrase residency is. Virtually every judicial decision have said that you should give that word its ordinary meaning. There's none of the islands have a problem in ascribing the ordinary meaning to the word residence. What we know across the board is that it cannot involve someone who lives abroad for decades come to Dominica for 2 or 3 days, vote on the basis that they are resident here because they're coming for 2 or 3 days or 2 weeks every year. It defies common sense. But that has been the cynical excuse used to perpetuate this illegality on the Dominican people. But for certainty, the change has to be made or should be made to expressly indicate what the word means. Now, mind you, I'm not saying that that will solve all the problems, because look, if the purpose of circumventing Dominican electoral laws is to remain in power indefinitely, is to be there for 50 years, then even if you get rid of one loophole, the powers that be will excavate another one. So the problem is not the legislation per se. The problem is the mindset that holds that somebody has a right to remain in power indefinitely, irrespective of the law. I cannot remember who said that no law, no constitution can stop me from doing this. Not even the courts, for God's sakes, had the integrity when confronted with a situation where it was beyond dispute that there were folks who hold political office who had dual citizenships. They didn't have the intellectual courage to apply the laws of civil procedure to ensure that that passport was produced. They came up with a cynical decision, knowing fully well it could not be appealed to the CCJ. And that is an integral part of the problem that we face. Mr. James made reference to some comment by a senior Queen's Counsel regarding the decision made with respect to the electoral petition, which ended up in the CCJ. It was intellectually corrupt. And we know why, those of us who make a living in the legal profession. So my last word is very simple. Those of us who are old as I, we remember Greek mythology. I remember the task that Hercules was given to clean out some stadiums, where you keep horses, which hadn't been cleaned for 40 years. And if he didn't succeed in cleaning those stables, quite frankly, there were serious repercussions. And what did he do? He diverted 7 rivers to clean out those stadiums. So the question is, do Dominicans have the courage to divert the rivers, to clean out those stables that hadn't been cleaned for 20 years in excess of? That is the question.
That's a good question for us to end on. I mean, it's already an ungodly hour, as you speak about the Bible references there, Dr. Andre. I want to thank everybody so much for attending tonight. Thank you so much, those of you who've been following us on Facebook and YouTube. We appreciate you. We did not get a chance to take many of your calls, but certainly for me, it was very highly educational, and I hope that kind of education is serving well on the population in general, so that people can be so much better informed, so that they can make informed decisions, so that when the Electoral Reform Coalition comes to the people and asks them to participate in a meaningful way, so that they can make their presence felt and their voices heard and their desires and their wishes established, I hope they will come out and pay attention and participate fully in that. And I want to thank you, Bernard and Dr. Fontaine and Dion George, Johnson, Boston, John Blanchard and Washbourne, Lambie, everybody, Dion, everybody, Sebra McKenzie. I'm not sure if Sebra is still with us. Sebza is still with us. I really want to thank everybody for turning out tonight. I think we had a very good discussion, and I'm so pleased that we could see that we're arriving towards some kind of a consensus on the big ticket items. I think things like the like the campaign finance reform, will be able to be resolved so much more easily than the whole question of the re-registration and the so and the residency matters. These are the main really sticking points. So once we look like we're getting closer, I hope that message can be conveyed to the rest of the population so everybody can be singing from the same hymn sheet. But I want to suggest to the Electoral Reform Coalition that maybe a position paper could be prepared out of all of those discussions that are there. And certainly the Dominica Business Forum had made recommendations. I believe many of those recommendations may have found their way in some way in Dennis Byron's recommendations and the laws that he's recommending. And Mr. James might be able to attest to that. And so I'm hoping that consensus can be arrived at. So instead of people going off on different tangents, everybody can sing from one same hymn sheet and get the job done. That is the only way to get the attention of the political directorate. After all, they would like to stay in there forever. But if the people decide otherwise, I don't think that can happen. So gentlemen, I want to thank everybody and say good night to everybody. And everybody, okay, excellent night to all. It's good. Have a good night's rest, everybody. Take care.
Good night and thanks for the opportunity.
All right, Washbourne, take care.
Yeah, good evening, all and sundry.
Okay.
Great discussion. Thank you to the panelists and the listeners, and Lambi and Sherwin.
Mr. James, good night, Mr. James. Good night, everybody.
Mr. James, I don't know if you.
Mr. Andrew.
Yeah, good. Mr. James, send me the email. I have some stuff to fire for you.
Oh, well, this kind of thing is above my head, so I'm not even going to bother to. And you fellas communicate.
Well, I do see a safety deposit box above your head, so you're absolutely correct.
Oh, you're looking at the wrong picture. You're looking at Mr. James. You're looking at, you're taking him from me, man. That's what is happening there. Anyway, fellas, good night, everybody.
Take care.
All
right, Mr. Andrew.
Yes.
Good night.
Good to see you. All is well.
Good night.
Oh, no, 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 no.